Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you all had a nice and filling lunch. Now, all of you, could you please, as a show of hands, tell me if you're at all familiar with the concept of vampires? Oh my gosh, that was a lot. There was a lot of people. And you know what, I'm not surprised because vampires are very much ingrained in our media and our culture. If you need an example, I can have some for you. Let's say you're interested in romance. You got the Twilight. Yeah. Or maybe if you like shows, you'll be more into True Blood or Vampire Diaries. But if you're an action sort of fan, you could go with Blade or Van Helsing. But maybe you're a movie buff. You like the old things. Nosferatu's probably more up your line. And everyone's favorite vampire-themed cereal is obviously Count Chocula. And let's not forget I Am Legend, or for the kiddies, Hotel Transylvania. And if you want something that encompasses all of that, you could go for Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And all of our favorite mathematician, the Count. Yeah. So, you can see, we really have vampires ingrained in our culture. But historically, vampires go back a bit farther than we tend to think. And they're a bit closer and more at home than we'd like to know. But I'm sure some of you have realized, I didn't put one vampire there. The super important one, Count Dracula. Here's where we'll start with Dracula and Bram Stoker. Now, Bram Stoker created Dracula in 1897. That's an important date, remember it. And he's, Dracula, considered the father of modern vampires. And I have to say modern because there are vampires before him, before the nice, suave, and sexy vampires that we've come to know and love today. Now, it's a fairly well-known fact that Stoker got his inspiration for Dracula from Vlad Dracula, or Vlad the Impaler, or Vlad the Third. And he was the Prince of Wallachia, which is a small country that is now located today in Romania. And he was born around 1428 and died around 1476 AD. And this man was not very good. He has a death toll attributed to him at a short estimate of 20,000 and a big one at 100. And I'm going to tell you the story of that short estimate of 20,000. Now, Vlad and his empire was surrounded by a lot of others, and the big one at the time was the Ottomans, and they were coming from the south. In 1462, Sultan Mehmed II came up from the Ottoman Empire with his army to Vlad the Impaler's city and to his castle. Then he, with his army, promptly turned around and left. That's because outside of his castle, there was a forest of bodies. There were 20,000 bodies impaled on 8-foot sticks. He just left it. This was not a very good man, if you can imagine. And he was eventually killed by beheading. And that's kind of important. We'll get into it a little later. But I want to know that still, this isn't where the first vampires start. The first ones are actually a different being. They're called the Revenants. And no, that is not. Although Leo was good, Revenants were more like this. Sort of macabre, undead creatures, usually with flesh and blood, sometimes without them. Now, Revenants came about as early as 1190 AD. That's when we get the first stories of them. One of the people who talked about them was William of Newburgh, if you know him. And these stories persisted all the way up through the 1800s, which is pretty close to our time if you really think about it. And revenant means, if you don't know, a person who is returned, specifically, in this case, from the dead. And here are some of the features that revenants would have. They like to drink blood, torture the living, and they kind of look like fresh-ish corpses. They've also been known to kill a lot of people. A lot of people. They really like killing. And if you're wondering how you become a revenant, it's quite simple. As the Russian Orthodox Church would tell you, if you don't believe in the Russian Orthodox Church, you're pretty much guaranteed to become a revenant. Now, there are a couple methods of killing revenants if you happen to come across one. The most popular ones were taking out hearts, lungs, and the liver, and then burning them. Or, in the more vampiric fashion these eventually came to be, the townspeople would find the revenant in question and take a stake, usually out of ashen wood or maybe iron, because that's what kills a lot of mythological creatures, if you don't know, and they would just drive it through their chest. Now, this doesn't kill them like it does our vampires today. It's more there to just keep them in place so they don't come up during the night and start killing everybody again. And then there's another fan favorite method of beheading. They find the revenant in question, chop off their head, and then place it next to their rectum so that they wouldn't be able to find it. Now, I really want to tell you, revenants aren't like zombies. They're not just random things. These were real people. It was John Smith, it was Mary Sue, or in this case, it was Mercy Brown. And Mercy is really the gateway between the old revenant of the past and the modern vampire we have today. So, I'll tell you her story. And it starts with consumption. If you don't know, consumption is a very old term for what we know today as tuberculosis. And if you've seen tuberculosis happen, it sort of eats away at the person, and that's why it had that name, consumption. And this story starts in 1883, when Mercy Brown's mother died from consumption. And obviously she was buried, because that's what you do with loved ones. You bury them. And a couple months later, her sister contracted consumption and died in 1884. So you bury her, and that's all good. And I'm not sure at what point this happened, but the townsfolk eventually became concerned with the family, thinking that something out of place was happening. And it probably started around when Edwin contracted consumption. And unlike the others, he lasted a while, for a good 6 or 7 years with tuberculosis. But in the winter of 1891, December, he started to take a really bad turn. And that's when Mercy Brown caught consumption. And she had what they call the galloping kind. And it went through her, and she died very quickly in January of 1892. But Edwin was still alive, and the townsfolk, they were scared at this point. 3 of these family members had died of consumption, and they weren't sure why. But they knew they could save Edwin, because they thought, just maybe, one of the women was infecting him, was sucking the life out of Edwin. So they did what any hysterical townsfolk would do. They asked the father if they could bury, or if they could exhume the bodies. So they did. And they were looking for any sort of inconsistency that would appear. So they exhumed the mom, and she looked thoroughly rotted, so they just left her. It's hard to be tried for a crime after you're dead for 10 years. Then they exhumed the sister, and she also looked pretty well rotted. Again, 10 years. But then they came to Mercy, who they had never even buried in the first place because it was winter. And where they put her was a crypt in the cemetery, basically a stone building that acts as a refrigerator. And when they got to her body, they were very surprised to see that she hadn't deteriorated at all. It's shocking. So, like the people before them, they decided the best course of action would be to rip out her heart and her liver and then burn them. But then they took it a little farther. They decided to take the ashes of the heart and liver and put it into a tonic. And they fed it to Edwin so that he would get better. As you can imagine, he didn't. He died 2 months later. But the story sort of lived on. People exhuming bodies and mutilating them tends to get around. And it was picked up by a newspaper called the New York World. And this is the interesting part. It fell into the hands of a London stage manager who happened to be touring around New York. And I think you might know this man. It was Bram Stoker. And the book was Dracula. Yes.
How is Edwin related to Mercy?
They were brothers and sisters.
Oh.
Sorry, I had a lot to go through. I went over time.
Yeah.
I saw them looking at me. A bit of shame.
Thank you. It was a great story.
What was the source of the story, Jeremy?
The source?
For the story of Mercy Brown? Where'd you find the story?
The internet. But, what?
Well, when it's not, bring up your sources again at the end, please, your works. Okay.
That
Is it up
one-
there?
Yeah.
There it is, Mercy Brown incident, okay.
Yeah.
Find a grave. Okay, all right.
They have the incident on her gravestone. And you can still find the stone that they burned her heart and liver on in Exeter, Rhode Island, which is where she was.
If you have road trips for you. Some nice acres like that.
Have you given any thought, consideration, again, this may not be part of your work, but I'm curious, the sort of vampire and zombie revival that has been so profound over the last 10 years or so, any sense of why that's the case?
Well, that's hard.
Again, it may be totally
I'd
away
say the
from...
revival started earlier, going back to the 1910s probably, with White Zombie and all of those movies that started coming out. But people tend to look towards other things that they don't have to quite deal with when troubles are happening. So, for zombies, for example, they're a very nice way to get away with moral dilemmas because they're not quite human. So it's okay to kill a zombie, but you wouldn't kill,
We had that conversation earlier, it's okay. It's okay, folks, I mean, I already did.
Unless he was a zombie.
Not murder.
Yeah. If they're undead, it's okay. So that kind of gets rid of the moral dilemma. And I feel like with all that's going on in the world, those sort of dilemmas happen more and more, and people have to confront them in some other way that they feel is socially acceptable.
Who's your favorite vampire and why?
I have to say, Count Chocula's pretty great.
Jeremy, would you say that people, going back to your idea of it's a dilemma that can be resolved, we could also apply that to hysteria over witches?
Yes.
Good answer.
Do you want me to talk more about witches? Could go to the Salem witch trials, the last witch trials in America. There were no witches in the witch trials, in case you're wondering. There was a dozen hangings and one man was pressed to death so that he wouldn't have to give up anyone else. But people just get hysterical. They turn to something else just to try and comprehend it.
It's intriguing. It's not just one country, it's worldwide.
Yes.
Good, thank you, Jeremy.